Halloween. It's overcast today, so we're taking a little bit of a gamble. My phone hopefully won't overheat, but I have been fooled in the past. Ugh, I don't even care. No one's here for my hair. So we are continuing on with the Necronomicon by H.P. Lovecraft, reading The Shadow Out of Time. Not the biggest fan of this one, but we're just going to power through it because I would love to get the rest of this done in this calendar year. So, part 4. I continued, however, to keep a careful record of the outre dreams which crowded upon me so thickly and vividly. Such a record, I argued, was of genuine value as a psychological document. The glimpses still seemed damnably like memories, though I fought off this impression with a goodly measure of success. In writing, I treated the phantasma as things seen, but at other times I brushed them aside like any gossamer illusions of the night. I'm going to figure out my bangs. I had never mentioned such matters in common conversation, though reports of them, filtering out such things had aroused... I had never mentioned such matters in common conversation, though reports of them, filtering out as such things had aroused sundry rumors regarding my mental health. It is amusing to reflect that these rumors were confined wholly to laymen, without a single champion among physicians or psychologists. Of my visions after 1914, I will here mention only a few, since fuller accounts and records are at the disposal of the serious student. It is evident that with time, the curious inhibitions somewhat waned, for the scope of my visions vastly increased. They have never, though, become other than disjointed fragments seemingly without clear motivation. Within the dreams, I seemed gradually to acquire a greater and greater freedom of wandering. I floated through many strange buildings of stone, going from one to the other along mammoth underground passages, which seemed to form the common avenues of transit. Sometimes I encountered those gigantic sealed trapdoors in the lowest level, around which such an aura of fear and forbiddenness clung. This is actually just bothering me, so hold on. Just this little chunk here. Ah, that's better. Slightly. Whatever. I saw tremendous tessellated pools and rooms of curious and inexplicable utensils of myriad sorts. Then there were colossal caverns of intricate machinery whose outlines and purpose were wholly strange to me, and whose sound manifested itself only after many years of dreaming. I may here remark that sight and sound are the only senses I have ever exercised in the visionary world. The real horror began in May 1915 when I first saw the living things. This was before my studies had taught me what, in view of the myths and case histories, to expect. As mental barriers wore down, I beheld great masses of thin vapor in various parts of the building and in the streets below. These steadily grew more solid and distinct, till at last I could trace their monstrous outlines with uncomfortable ease. They seemed to be enormous, iridescent cones, about 10 feet high and 10 feet wide at the base, and made up of some ridgy, scaly, semi-elastic matter. From their apexes projected 4 flexible, cylindrical members, each a foot thick, and of a ridgy substance like that of the cones themselves. These members were sometimes contracted almost to nothing, and sometimes extended to any distance up to about 10 feet. Terminating 2 of them were enormous claws or nippers. At the end of a third were 4 red, trumpet-like appendages. The 4th terminated into an irregular yellowish globe some 2 feet in diameter, and having 3 great dark eyes ranged along its central circumference. Surmounting this head were 4 slender gray stalks bearing flower-like appendages, whilst from its nether side dangled 8 greenish antennae or tentacles. The great base of the central cone was fringed with a rubbery gray substance which moved the whole entity through expansion and contraction. Their actions, though harmless, horrified me even more than their appearance, for it is not wholesome to watch monstrous objects doing what one had only known human beings to do. These objects moved intelligently about the great rooms, getting books from the shelves and taking them to the great tables, or vice versa, and sometimes writing diligently with a peculiar rod gripped in the greenish head tentacles. The huge nippers were used in carrying books and in conversation, speech consisting of a kind of clicking. The objects had no clothing, but wore satchels or knapsacks suspended from the top of the conical trunk. They commonly carried their head and its supporting member at the level of the cone top, though it was frequently raised or lowered. Gross. And just one moment. Ooh. Is everyone excited for Halloween? I'm so excited. Oh. Raised or lowered? Huh? Yes. Ugh, I do this every time. The other three great members tended to rest downwards at the sides of the cone, contracted to about 5 feet each when not in use. From their rate of reading, writing, and operating their machines, those on the table seemed somehow connected through it, I concluded that their intelligence was enormously greater than man's. Afterward, I saw them everywhere, swarming in all the great chambers and corridors, tending monstrous machines in vaulted crypts and racing along the vast roads in gigantic boat-shaped cars. I ceased to be afraid of them, for they seemed to form supremely natural parts of their environment. Individual differences among them began to be manifest, and a few appeared to be under some kind of restraint. These latter, though showing no physical variation, had a diversity of gestures and habits which marked them off not only from the majority, but very largely from one another. They wrote a great deal in what seemed to my cloudy vision a vast variety of characters, never the typical curvilinear hieroglyphs of the majority, and few, I fancied, used our own familiar alphabet. Most of them worked much more slowly than the general mass of the entities. All this time, my own part in the dream seemed to be that of a disembodied consciousness, with a range of vision wider than the normal, floating freely about, yet confined to the ordinary avenues and speeds of travel. Not until August 1915 did any suggestions of bodily existence begin to harass me. I say harass because the first phase was a purely abstract, though infinitely terrible association of my previously noted body loathing with the scenes of my visions. For a while, my chief concern during dreams was to avoid looking down at myself, and I recall how grateful I was for the total absence of large mirrors in the strange rooms. I was mightily troubled by the fact that I always saw the great tables, whose height could be not under 10 feet, from a level not below that of their surfaces. And then the morbid temptation to look down at myself became greater and greater, till one night I could not resist it. At first, my downward glance revealed nothing whatever. A moment later, I perceived that this was because my head lay at the end of a flexible neck of enormous length. Retracting this neck and gazing down very sharply, I saw the scaly, rugose, iridescent bulk of a vast cone, 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide at the base. That was when I waked half of Arkham with my screaming as I plunged madly up from the abyss of sleep. That's horrifying to picture, actually. Only after weeks of hideous repetition did I grow half reconciled to these visions of myself in monstrous form. In the dreams, I now moved bodily among the other unknown entities, reading terrible books from the endless shelves and writing for hours at the great tables, with a stylus managed by the green tentacles that hung down from my head. Snatches of what I read and wrote would linger in my memory. There were horrible annals of other worlds and other universes, and of stirrings of formless life outside of all universes. There were records of strange orders of beings which had peopled the world in forgotten pasts, and frightful chronicles of grotesque-bodied intelligences which would people it millions of years after, millions of years after the death of the last human being. I learned of chapters in human history whose existence no scholar of today has ever suspected. Most of these writings were in the language of the hieroglyphs, which I studied in a queer way with the aid of droning machines, and which was evidently an agglutinative speech, with root systems utterly unlike any found in human languages. Other volumes were in other unknown tongues learned in the same queer way. A very few were in languages I knew. Extremely clever pictures, both interested in the records and forming separate collections, aided me immensely. And all the time I seemed to be setting down a history of my own age in English. On waking, I could recall only minute and meaningless scraps of the unknown tongues which my dream self had mastered, though whole phrases of the history stayed with me. I learned, even before my waking self had studied the parallel cases or the old myths from which the dreams doubtless sprang, that the entities around me were of the world's greatest race, which had conquered time and had sent exploring minds into every age. I knew, too, that I had been snatched from my age, while another used my body in that age, and that a few of the other strange forms housed similarly captured minds. Done with the Odyssey. Yes, we are done with the Odyssey. Finished that about a week ago, I think. I finished it before I went on my trip, so a couple weeks ago. I seemed to talk in some odd language of claw clicking with exiled intellects from every corner of the solar system. How was it? How was the Odyssey? It was good. Yeah. Yeah, it was good. No further comment. There was a mind from the planet we know as Venus, which would live incalculable epochs to come, and one from an outer moon of Jupiter 6 million years in the past. Of earthly minds, there were some from the winged, star-headed, half-vegetable race of Paleogean Antarctica, one from the reptile people of fabled Volusia, 3 from the furry pre-human Hyperborean worshippers of Sathagua, 1 from the holy abominable Chochos, 2 from the arachnid denizens of Earth's last age, 5 from the hardy Coleopterus, species immediately following mankind, to which the great race was someday to transfer its keenest minds en masse in the face of horrible peril, and several from different branches of humanity. Oh great, this whole page is filled with stuff I don't know how to pronounce. I brought books to read, seeing you, but can't read. What do you mean? You can't read? You can listen to audiobooks. You can listen to my YouTube channel. I talked with the mind of Yang Li, a philosopher from the cruel empire of Sanshan, which is to come in AD 5000, with that of a general of the great-headed brown people who held South Africa in 50,000 BC, with that of a 12th century Florentine monk named Bartolomeo Corsi, with that of a king of Lomar who had ruled that terrible polar land 100,000 years before the squat, yellow Inudos came from the west to engulf it. I talked with the mind of Nugsoth, the magician of the Dark Conquerors of AD 16,000, with that of a Roman named Titus Sempronius Balsus, who had been a Kester in Sulla's time. With that of Nepnes, an Egyptian of the 14th dynasty, who told me the hideous secret of Nyarlathotep, with that of a priest of Atlantis' Middle Kingdom, with that of a Suffolk gentleman of Cromwell's day, James Woodville, with that of a court astronomer of pre-Inca Peru, with that of the Australian physicist Neville Kingston Brown, who will die in AD 2518, with that of an archimage of vanished Yi in the Pacific, with that of Theodotes, a Greco-Bactrian official of 200 BC, with that of an aged Frenchman of Louis XIII's time named Pierre-Louis Montagny, with that of Cromia, a Cimmerian chieftain of 15,000 BC, and with so many others that my brain cannot hold the shocking secrets and dizzying marvels I learned from them. My brain can't hold all of these names. I awakened each morning in a fever, sometimes frantically trying to verify or discredit such information as fell within the range of modern human knowledge. Traditional facts took on new and doubtful aspects, and I marveled at the dream fancy which could invent such surprising addenda to history and science. I shivered at the mysteries the past may conceal, and trembled at the menaces the future may bring forth. What was hinted in the speech of post-human entities of the fate of mankind produced such an effect on me that I will not set it down here. After man, there would be the mighty beetle civilization, the bodies of whose members the cream of the great race would seize when the monstrous doom overtook the elder world. Later, as the earth span closed, the transferred minds would again migrate through time and space, to another stopping place in the bodies of the bulbous vegetative entities of Mercury. But there would be races after them, clinging pathetically to the cold planet and burrowing to its horror-filled core before the utter end. Meanwhile, in my dreams, I wrote endlessly in that history of my own age which I was preparing, half voluntarily and half through promises of increased library and travel opportunities, for the great race's central archives. The archives were in a colossal subterranean structure near the city's center, which I came to know well through frequent labors and consultations. Meant to last as long as the race and to withstand the fiercest of Earth's convulsions, this Titan repository surpassed all other buildings in the massive, mountain-like firmness of its construction. The records, written or printed on great sheets of a curiously tenacious cellulose fabric, were bound into books that opened from the top, and were kept in individual cases of a strange, extremely light, rustless metal of grayish hue, decorated with mathematical designs and bearing the title in the great race's curvilinear hieroglyphs. These cases were stored in tiers of rectangular vaults, like closed, locked shelves, wrought of the same rustless metal and fastened by knobs with intricate turnings. My own history was assigned a specific place in the vaults of the lowest or vertebrae level, the section devoted to the cultures of mankind and of the furry and reptilian races immediately preceding it in terrestrial dominance. But none of the dreams ever gave me a full picture of daily life. All were the merest misty, disconnected fragments, and it is certain that these fragments were not unfolded in their rightful sequence. I have, for example, a very imperfect idea of my own living arrangements in the dream world, though I seem to have possessed a great stone room of my own. My restrictions as a prisoner gradually disappeared, so that some of the visions included vivid travels over the mighty jungle roads, sojourns in strange cities, and explorations of some of the vast, dark, windowless ruins from which the great race shrank in curious fear. There were also long sea voyages in enormous, many-decked boats of incredible swiftness, and trips over wild regions enclosed projectile-like airships and moved by electrical repulsion. Beyond the wide, warm ocean were other cities of the great race, and on one far continent I saw the crude villages of the black-snouted, winged creatures who would evolve as a dominant stock over the great race after the great race had sent its foremost minds into the future to escape the creeping horror. Flatness and exuberant green life were always the keynote of the scene. Hills were low and sparse and usually displayed signs of volcanic forces. We're just going to block this person really quick. Ben. Bye. Okay. Of the animals I saw, I could write volumes. All were wild, for the great race's mechanized culture had long since done away with domestic beasts, while food was wholly vegetable or synthetic. Domestic beasts, not domestic beasts. Clumsy reptiles of great bulk floundering in steamy morasses, fluttered in the heavy air, or sprouted in the sea and lakes. And among these, I fancied I could vaguely recognize lesser, archaic prototypes of many forms: dinosaurs, pterodactyls, ichthyosauruses, labyrinthodons, plesiosaurus, and the like. Labyrinthodonts? What's a labyrinthodont? Never heard of that one. Made familiar through paleontology. Of birds or mammals, there were none that I could discover. The ground and swamps were constantly alive with snakes, lizards, and crocodiles, while insects buzzed incessantly among the lush vegetation. And far out at sea, an unknown monsters sprouted mountainous columns of foam into the vaporous sky. Once, I was taken under the ocean in a gigantic submarine vessel with searchlights and glimpsed some living horrors of awesome magnitude. I also saw the ruins of incredible sunken cities and the wealth of crinoid, brachiopod, coral, and ichthyc life which everywhere abounded. Of the physiology, folkways, and detailed history of the great race, my visions preserved but little information, and many of the scattered points I here set down were gleaned from my study of old lessons and other cases rather than from my own dreaming. For in time, of course, my reading and research caught up with and passed the dreams in many phases, so that certain dream fragments were explained in advance and formed verifications of what I had learned. This consolingly established my belief that similar reading and research, accomplished by my secondary self, had formed the source of the whole terrible fabric of pseudo-memories. The period of my dreams, apparently, was one somewhat less than 150 million years ago, when the Paleozoic age was giving place to the Mesozoic. A million is 6 zeros, right? The bodies occupied by the great race represented no surviving, or even scientifically known, line of terrestrial evolution, but were of a peculiar, closely homogeneous, we're learning to read today, were of a peculiar, closely homogeneous, and highly specialized organic type, inclining as much to the vegetable as to the animal state. Cell action was of a unique sort, almost precluding fatigue and wholly eliminating the need of sleep. Nourishment, assimilated through the red trumpet-like appendages on one of the great flexible limbs, was always semi-fluid and in many aspects wholly unlike the food of existing animals. The beings had but two of the senses which we recognize, sight and hearing, the latter accomplished through the flower-like appendages on the grey stalks above their heads. Of other and incomprehensible senses, not, however, well utilizable by alien captive minds inhabiting their bodies, they possessed many. Their 3 eyes were so situated as to give them a range of vision wider than the normal. Their blood was a sort of deep greenish ichor of great thickness. They had no sex, but reproduced through seeds or spores which clustered on their bases and could be developed only under water. Great, shallow tanks were used for the growth of their young, which were, however, reared only in small numbers on account of the longevity of individuals, 4,000 or 5,000 years before the common lifespan. Being the common lifespan, Markedly defective individuals were quickly disposed of as soon as their defects were noticed. Disease and the approach of death were, in the absence of a sense of touch or of physical pain, recognized by purely visual symptoms. The dead were incinerated with dignified ceremonies. Once in a while, as before mentioned, a keen mind would escape death by forward projection in time, but such cases were not numerous. This reads like a textbook, and it's losing me. When one did occur, the exiled mind from the future was treated with the utmost kindness till the dissolution of its unfamiliar tenement. The great race seemed to form a single, loosely knit nation or league, with major institutions in common, though there were 4 definite divisions. The political and economic system of each unit was a sort of fascistic socialism, with major resources rationally distributed, and power delegated to a small governing board elected by the votes of all able to pass certain educational and psychological tests. Family organization was not overstressed, though ties among persons of common descent were recognized, and the young were generally reared by their parents. Resemblances to human attitudes and institutions were, of course, most marked in those fields where, on the one hand, highly abstract elements were concerned, or where, on the other hand, there was a dominance of the basic, unspecialized urges common to all organic life. A few added likenesses came through conscious adoption as the great race probed the future and copied what it liked. Industry, highly mechanized, demanded but little time from each citizen, and the abundant leisure was filled with the intellectual and aesthetic activities of various sorts. The sciences were carried to an unbelievable height of development, and art was a vital part of life, though at the period of my dreams it had passed its crest and meridian. Technology was enormously stimulated through the constant struggle to survive and to keep in existence the physical fabric of great cities imposed by the prodigious geologic upheavals of those primal days. Crime was surprisingly scant and was dealt with through highly efficient policing. Punishments ranged from privilege deprivation and imprisonment to death or major emotion wrenching, and were never administered without a careful study of the criminal's motivations. Warfare, largely civil for the last few millennia, though sometimes waged against the winged, star-headed old ones who centered in the Antarctic, was infrequent, though infinitely devastating. An enormous army, using camera-like weapons which produced tremendous electrical effects, was kept on hand for purposes seldom mentioned, but obviously connected with the ceaseless fear of the dark, windowless elder ruins and of the great sealed trapdoors in the lower subterranean levels. This fear of the basalt ruins and trapdoors was largely a matter of unspoken suggestion, or, at most, of furtive quasi-whispers. Everything specific which bore on it was significantly absent from such books as were on the common shelves. It was the one subject lying altogether under a taboo among the great race, and seemed to be connected alike with horrible bygone struggles, and with that future peril which would some day force the race to send its keener minds ahead en masse in time. What's a donut county? It's a game. It's a Xbox game. And it's goofy. You're just a donut and you go around and just eat things. Like a hole in the ground, and you just kind of, and it gets bigger. It's kind of fun. I mean, I played it all of one time on stream. Imperfect and fragmentary as were the other things presented by dreams and legends, this matter was still more bafflingly shrouded. The vague old myths avoided it, or perhaps all illusions had for some reason been excised. And in the dreams of myths of myself and in the dreams of myself and others, the hints were peculiarly few. It's almost the end of the week. Members of the great race never intentionally referred to the matter, and what could be gleaned came only from some of the more observant captive minds. According to these scraps of information, the basis of the fear was a horrible elder race of half-polypus, utterly alien entities, which had come through space from immeasurably distant universes and had dominated the Earth and 3 other solar planets about 600 million years ago. They were only partly material, as we understand matter, and their type of consciousness and media of perception differed widely from those of terrestrial organisms. For example, their senses did not include that of sight, their mental world being a strange, non-visual pattern of impressions. They were, however, sufficiently material to use implements of normal matter when in cosmic areas containing it, and they required housing, albeit of a peculiar kind. Hello. Though their senses could penetrate all material barriers, their substance could not, and certain forms of electrical energy could wholly destroy them. They had the power of aerial motion, despite the absence of wings or any other visible means of levitation. Their minds were of such texture that no exchange with them could be effected by the great race. When these things had come to earth, they had built mighty basalt cities of windowless towers, and had preyed horribly upon the beings they found. Thus it was, when the minds of the great race sped across the void from that obscure, transgalactic world known in the disturbing and debatable Outtown shards as Yith. The newcomers, with the instruments they created, had found it easy to subdue the predatory entities and drive them down to those caverns of inner earth which they already joined to their abodes and begun to inhabit. The Necronomicon, I think you know from the series from... This is the Necronomicon. Yes. This book specifically is the Shadow Out of Time. Then they had sealed the entrances and left them to their fate, afterwards occupying most of their great cities and preserving certain important buildings for reasons connected more with superstition than with indifference, boldness, or scientific and historic zeal. But, as the eons passed, there came vague, evil signs that the elder things were growing strong and numerous in the inner world. There were sporadic eruptions of particularly hideous characters in certain small and remote cities of the great race, and in some of the deserted elder cities which the great race had not peopled, places where the paths to the gulfs below had not been properly sealed or guarded. After that, greater precautions were taken, and many of the paths were closed forever, though a few were left with sealed trapdoors for strategic use in fighting the elder things, if ever they broke forth in unexpected places. The eruptions of the elder things must have been shocking beyond all description, since they had permanently colored the psychology of the great race. Such was the fixed mood of horror that the very aspect of the creatures was left unmentioned. At no time was I able to gain a clear hint of what they looked like. There were veiled suggestions of a monstrous plasticity and of temporary lapses of visibility, while other fragmentary whispers referred to their control and military use of great winds. Singular whistling noises and colossal footprints made up of 5 circular toe marks seemed also to be associated with them. Thank you, 160 followers. Thank you to whoever just followed me. It was evident that the coming doom so desperately feared by the great race, the doom that was one day to send millions of keen minds across the chasm of time to strange bodies in a safer future, had to do with the final successful eruption of the elder beings. Mental projections down the ages had clearly foretold such a horror, and the great race had resolved that none who could escape it should face it. That the foray would be a matter of vengeance rather than an attempt to reoccupy the outer world they knew from the planet's later history, for their projections showed the coming and going of subsequent races untroubled by the monstrous entities. Perhaps these entities had come to prefer Earth's inner abysses to the variable, storm-ravaged surface, since light meant nothing to them. Perhaps, too, they were slowly weakening with the eons. Indeed, it was known that they would be quite dead in the time of the post-human beetle race which the fleeting minds would tenant. Meanwhile, the great race maintained its cautious vigilance, with potent weapons ceaselessly ready, despite the horrified banishing of the subject from common speech and visible records. And always the shadow of nameless fear hung about the sealed trapdoors and the dark, windowless elder towers. Yeah, that one read like a textbook. Let's continue on. Let's do part 5. That is the world of which my dreams brought me dim, scattered echoes every night. I cannot hope to give any true idea of the horror and dread contained in such echoes, for it was upon a wholly intangible quality, the sharp sense of pseudo-memory, that such feelings mainly depended. As I have said, my studies gradually gave me a defense against these feelings in the form of rational psychological explanations, and this saving influence was augmented by the subtle touch of accustomedness which comes with the passage of time. Yet in spite of everything, the vague, creeping terror would return momentarily now and then. It did not, however, engulf me as it had before, and after 1922, I lived a very normal life of work and recreation. In the course of years, I began to feel that my experience, together with the kindred cases and the related folklore, ought be definitely summarized and published for the benefit of serious students. Hence, I prepared a series of articles briefly covering the whole ground and illustrated with crude sketches of some of the shapes, scenes, decorative motifs, and hieroglyphs remembered from these dreams. These appeared at various times during 1928 and 1929 in the Journal of the American Psychological Study, but did not attract much attention. Meanwhile, I continued to record my dreams with the minutest care, even though the growing stack of reports attained troublesomely vast proportions. On July 10, 1934, there was forwarded to me by the Psychological Society the letter which opened the culminating and most horrible phase of the whole mad ordeal. It was postmarked Pilbara, Western Australia, and bore the signature of one whom I found, upon inquiry, to be a mining engineer of considerable prominence. Enclosed were some very curious snapshots. I will reproduce the text in its entirety, and no reader can fail to understand how tremendous an effect it and the photographs had upon me. I was, for a time, almost stunned and incredulous, for, although I had often thought that some basis of fact must underlie certain phases of the legends which had colored my dreams, I was none the less unprepared for anything like a tangible survival from a lost world remote beyond all imagination. Most devastating of all were the photographs, for here, in cold, incontrovertible realism, there stood out against a background of sand certain worn-down, water-ridged, storm-weathered blocks of stone, whose slightly convex tops and slightly concave bottoms told of their own story. And when I studied them with a magnifying glass, I could see all too plainly, amidst the batterings and pittings, the traces of those vast curvilinear designs and occasional hieroglyphs whose significance had become so hideous to me. But here is the letter, which speaks for itself. 49 Dampier Street, Pilbara, West Australia, May 18, 1934. Professor N.W. Peasley, care of A.M. Psychological Society, 30 East of 41st Street, New York City, USA. My dear sir, a recent conversation with Dr. E.M. Boyle of Perth and some papers with your articles, which he has just sent me, make it advisable for me to tell you about certain things I have seen in the great sandy desert east of our gold field here. It would seem, in view of the particular legends about old cities with huge stonework and strange designs and hieroglyphs which you describe, that I have come upon something very important. The blackfellows have always been full of talks about great stones with marks on them, and seem to have a terrible fear of such things. They connect them in some way with their common racial legends about Budai, the gigantic old man who lies asleep for ages underground with its head on his arm, and who will someday awake and eat up the world. There are some very old and half-forgotten tales of enormous underground huts of great stones, where passages lead down, and where horrible things have happened. The blackfellows claim that once some warriors, fleeing in battle, went down into one and never came back, but that frightful winds began to blow from the place soon after they went down. However, there usually isn't much in what these natives say. But what I have to tell is more than this. 2 years ago, when I was prospecting about 500 miles in the desert, I came on a lot of queer pieces of dressed stone, perhaps 3 by 2 by 2 feet in size, and weathered and pitted to the very limit. At first, I couldn't find any of the marks the blackfellows told about, but when I looked close enough, I could make out some deeply carved lines in spite of the weathering. There were peculiar curves, just like what the blackfellows had tried to describe. I imagine there must have been 30 or 40 blocks, some nearly buried in the sand, and all within a circle perhaps 1/4 of a mile in diameter. When I saw some, I looked around closely for more and made careful reckoning of the place with my instruments. I also took pictures of 10 or 12 of the most typical blocks and will enclose these prints for you to see. I turned my information and pictures over to the government at Perth, but they have done nothing about them. Then I met Dr. Boyle, who had read your articles in a journal of the American Psychological Society, and in time happened to mention the stones. He was enormously interested and became quite excited when I showed him my snapshots, saying that the stones and the markings were just like those of the masonry you had dreamed about and seen described in legends. Fuck, is it raining? I gotta walk somewhere after this. Shit. He meant to write to you, but was delayed. Meanwhile, he sent me most of the magazines with your articles, and I saw at once, from your drawings and descriptions, that my stones are certainly the kind you mean. You can appreciate this from the enclosed prints. Later on, you will hear directly from Dr. Boyle. Now, I can understand how important all of this will be to you. Without question, we are faced with the remains of an unknown civilization, older than any dreamed of before, and forming a basis for your legends. As a mining engineer, I have some knowledge of geology and can tell you that these blocks are so ancient that they frighten me. They are mostly sandstone and granite, though one is almost certainly made of a queer sort of cement or concrete. They bear evidence of water action, as if this part of the world had been submerged and come up again after long ages, all since those blocks were made and used. It is a matter of hundreds of thousands of years, or heaven knows how much more. I don't like to think about it. In view of your previous diligent work in tracking down the legends and everything connected with them, I cannot doubt but that you will want to lead an expedition to the desert and make some archaeological excavations. I would love to be a part of an archaeological excavation. I'll tell you that for free. Both Dr. Boyle and I are prepared to cooperate in such work if you, or organizations known to you, can furnish the funds. I can get together a dozen miners for the heavy digging. The blackfellows will be of no use, for I found that they have an almost maniacal fear of this particular spot. Boyle and I are saying nothing to others, for you very obviously ought to have precedence in any discoveries or credit. The place can be reached from Pilbara in about 4 days by motor tractor, which we'd need for our apparatus. It is somewhat west and south of Warburton's Path of 1873 and 100 miles southeast of Joanna Spring. We could float things up the De Grey River instead of starting from Pilbara, but that can be talked about later. Roughly, the stones lie at a point 22 degrees, 3 foot 14 inches south latitude, 125 degrees, 0 feet 39 inches east longitude. The climate is tropical and the desert conditions are trying. I shall welcome further correspondence upon this subject, and am indeed keenly eager to assist in any plan you may advise. After studying your articles, I am deeply impressed with the profound significance of the whole matter. Dr. Boyle will write later. When rapid communication is needed, a cable to Perth can be relayed by wireless. Hoping profoundly for an early message. Believe me, most faithfully yours, Robert B.F. Mackenzie. Of the immediate aftermath of this letter, much can be learned from the press. My good fortune in securing the backing of Miskatonic University was great, and both Mr. Mackenzie and Dr. Boyle proved invaluable in arranging matters at the Australian end. We were not too specific with the public about our objects, since the whole matter would have lent itself unpleasingly to sensational and jocose treatment by the cheaper newspapers. As a result, printed reports are sparing, but enough appear to tell of our quest for reported Australian ruins and to chronicle our various preparatory steps. Professor William Dyer of the college's geology department, leader of the Miskatonic Antarctic Expedition of 1930 to 31, Ferdinand C. Ashley of the Department of Ancient History, and Tyler M. Freeborn of the Department of Anthropology, together with my son Wingate, accompanied me. My correspondent, Mackenzie, came to Arkham early in 1935 and assisted in our final preparations. He proved to be a tremendously competent and affable man of about 50, admirably well-read and deeply familiar with all the conditions of Australian travel. He had tractors waiting at Pilbara, and we chartered a tramp steamer sufficiently small to get up the river to that point. We were prepared to excavate in the most careful and scientific fashion, sifting every particle of sand and disturbing nothing which might seem to be in or near its original situation. Sailing from Boston aboard the Wheezy Lexington on March 28, 1935, we had a leisurely trip across the Atlantic and Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, down the Red Sea, and across the Indian Ocean to our goal. I need not tell how the sight of the low, sandy West Australian coast depressed me, and how I detested the crude mining town and dreary gold fiends where the tractors were given their last loads. Dr. Boyle, who met us, proved to be elderly, pleasant, and intelligent, and his knowledge of psychology led him into many long discussions with my son and me. Discomfort and expectancy were oddly mingled in most of us when at length our party of 18 rattled forth over the arid leagues of sand and rock. On Friday, May 31st, we forded a branch of the De Grey and entered the realm of utter desolation. A certain positive terror grew on me as we advanced to this actual sight of the elder world beyond the legends. A terror, of course, abetted by the fact that my disturbing dreams and pseudo-memories still beset me with unabated force. It was on Monday, June 3rd, that we saw the first of the half-buried blocks. I cannot describe the emotions with which I actually touched, in objective reality, a fragment of cyclopean masonry in every respect like the blocks in the walls of my dream buildings. There was a distinct trace of carving, and my hands trembled as I recognized part of a curvilinear decorative scheme made hellish to me through years of tormenting nightmare and baffling research. A month of digging brought a total of some 1,250 blocks in varying stages of wear and disintegration. Most of these were carven megaliths with curved tops and bottoms. A minority were smaller, flatter, plain-surfaced and square or octagonally cut, like those of the floors and pavements in my dreams. A few were singularly massive and curved or slanted in such a manner as to suggest use in vaulting or groining, or as parts of arches or round window casings. The deeper, and the further north and east we dug, the more blocks we found, though we still failed to discover any trace of arrangement among them. Professor Dyer was appalled at the measureless age of the fragments, and Freeborn found traces of symbols which fitted darkly into certain Papuan and Polynesian legends of infinite antiquity. The condition and scattering of the blocks told mutely of vertiginous cycles of time and geologic upheavals of cosmic savagery. We had an aeroplane with us, and my son Wingate would often go up to different heights and scan the sand and rock waste for signs of dim, large-scale outlines, either differences of level or trails of scattered blocks. His results were virtually negative, for whenever he would one day think he had glimpsed some significant trend, he would on his next trip find the impression replaced by another equally insubstantial, a result of the shifting wind-blown sand. One or two of these ephemeral suggestions, though, affected me queerly and disagreeably. What is going on here? Okay. Whatever that means. One or two of these ephemeral suggestions, though, affected me queerly and disagreeably. They seemed, after a fashion, to dovetail horribly with something I had dreamed or read, but which I could no longer remember. There was a terrible familiarity about them, which somehow made me look furtively and apprehensively over the abominable, sterile terrain. Around the first week in July, I developed an unaccountable set of mixed emotions about that general northeasterly region. There was horror and there was curiosity, but more than that, there was a persistent and perplexing illusion of memory. I tried all sorts of psychological expedients to get these notions out of my head, but met with no success. Sleeplessness also gained upon me, but I almost welcomed this because of the resultant shortening of my dream periods. I acquired the habit of taking long, lone walks in the desert after night, or in the desert late at night, usually to the north or northeast, whither the sum of my strange new impulses seemed subtly to pull me. Sometimes, on these walks, I would stumble over nearly buried fragments of the ancient masonry. Though there were fewer visible blocks here than when we had started, I felt sure that there must be a vast abundance beneath the surface. The ground was less level than at our camp, and the prevailing high winds now and then plied the sands into fantastic temporary hillocks, exposing low traces of the elder stones while it covered other traces. I was queerly anxious to have the excavations extend to this territory, yet at the same time dreaded what might be revealed. Obviously, I was getting into a rather bad state, all the worse because I could not account for it. An indication of my poor nervous health can be gained from my response to an odd discovery which I made on one of my nocturnal rambles. It was on the evening of July 11, when the moon flooded the mysterious hillocks with a curious pallor. Wandering somewhat beyond my usual limits, I came upon a great stone which seemed to differ markedly from any we had yet encountered. It was almost wholly covered, but I stooped and cleared away the sand with my hands, later studying the object carefully and supplementing the moonlight with my electric torch. Unlike the other very large rocks, this one was perfectly square-cut, with no convex or concave surface. It seemed, too, to be of a dark basaltic substance, wholly dissimilar to the granite and sandstone and occasional concrete of the now familiar fragments. Suddenly I rose, turned, and ran for the camp at top speed. It was a wholly unconscious and irrational flight, and only when I was close to my tent did I fully realize why I had run. Then it came to me. The queer dark stone was something which I had dreamed and read about, and which was linked with the uttermost horrors of the eon-old legendary. It was one of the blocks of that basaltic elder masonry which the fabled great race held in such fear, the tall, windowless ruins left by those brooding, half-material alien things that festered in Earth's nether abysses and against whose wind-like, invisible forces the trapdoors were sealed and the sleepless sentinels posed. I remained awake all night, but by dawn realized how silly I had been to let the shadows of a myth upset me. Instead of being frightened, I should have had a discoverer's enthusiasm. It's a hard word. The next forenoon I told the others about my find, and Dyer, Freeman, Boyle, my son and I set out to view the anomalous block. Failure, however, confronted us. I had formed no clear idea of the stone's location, and a late wind had wholly altered the hillocks of Shifting Stand. Okay, that is where we are going to end today. Thank you for reading with me. I will upload this on YouTube. I hope you have a great day. And tomorrow's Halloween. Yay! Okay, bye.